Okay, so I've been beating my own drum for a while, but I really do play the drums. So I'm open now to questions about anything, really.
Alrighty, thank you very much. We got a question here. I have a question about diet from Pierre. He was told by his doctor that a meal of liver or kidney would be equivalent to 1 phlebotomy in his life. What's your thoughts on eating liver?
That general idea is out there, that you can get iron out of your system a lot quicker with phlebotomy than by manipulating your diet. So that's sort of the story, that you can eat whatever you want. We can get the iron out with a few phlebotomies a year. Don't worry about it. Now, we should be advocating a healthy diet for all our patients. So eating massive amounts of fatty meat and so on is not a great diet for anybody. But there's no reason why patients should be completely restricted from that. That probably applies to alcohol too. That if you're an early diagnosis and you don't have cirrhosis when you're diagnosed, you could have some modest alcohol intake. But heavy alcohol intake can definitely make hemochromatosis liver disease worse.
All right, we have a question from Elizabeth. Just a little clarification on H63D. So you included this in the AIRS study.
Yep.
But is it now being discounted as a factor?
It really is. We've never seen an H63D homozygote with organ damage like cirrhosis or heart disease. That's not to say you can't have a high ferritin, you can, but not usually a super high ferritin. It's been estimated that 1% of H63D homozygotes have a ferritin elevation. It's a little bit higher for the compound heterozygotes, C282Y/H63D. But that's another group where there's never been a case of cirrhosis reported. If there is, there's often another risk factor like heavy alcohol and so on. The H63D mutation is seen in 1 in 5 of the general population. So it's really, if that was causing iron overload, it would be all over the place. It's not the reason why 20% of men have a high ferritin.
Another question from Martin. Question for Dr. Adams. Why is it that some C282Y positive people don't seem to express any disease symptoms? Could there be a possible cofactor?
Yes, that's a really good question. And we've been looking for that missing link for a long time. And I have a project that we've been doing for years with the NIH, where we did something called exome sequencing. It's a type of genetic sequencing. It doesn't test every gene, it tests about 10% of your genes. And we were looking for associations with new genes to explain that, and we didn't find anything. And now with this whole genomic sequencing, we'll be able to look at every gene that we know about to see if there could be a cofactor. But it seems like that phenomenon is mostly in young women. And it's very uncommon for you to find a family of non-expressors. That's what we were hoping, that we would see a pattern where the brother is a non-expressor and the sister's a non-expressor. When we looked at that, it's always the women in the family that are the non-expressors. So many genetic diseases are like this, that you can have it very severe or you can have apparently no sequelae. I did publish a case last year that raised a few eyebrows of a young man who was a C282Y homozygote whose whole life had normal ferritin and transference saturation. And then at age 38, he had to have both knees replaced with what was felt to be classic hemochromatosis arthritis with no iron overload. So we're not sure that every symptom in hemochromatosis is related to iron.
Perfect, thank you. Jeff has a question. His sister, who lives in the States, gave him a bottle of Ironology, iron block tablets. It contains Cur-Q Life. Do you believe this will do anything?
I don't know anything about it. Just from the name, it sounds like curcumin, you know, which is an Indian spice that's in curry, like turmeric. But I don't know the product. Turmeric and curcumin has anti-inflammatory properties. So those are heavily promoted in health food stores for aches and pains and so on. But again, I think you should go back to the provider, the person that sells this stuff, and says, what evidence is there that this stuff works?
Another question from Joe, does a protein C deficiency affect hemochromatosis?
Well, I don't know. That's an uncommon disease too that affects blood clotting. And certainly, you know, you can have more than one genetic disease. You know, clots can be quite serious depending where they are in your body. So I just think that's the unlikely event of two things happening in the same person.
Alrighty, question from Darren. I am a marathon runner. I find that when my ferritin was below 100, my performance was low. What would you think an optimum ferritin should be for this type of athlete? And does the iron help hold more oxygen in the blood?
That's a good question. There have been lots of interesting studies done in extreme athletes, including the British Olympic team, that suggests that they're having heart attacks during these running events and so on. So that's probably not great. We had a guy in my department that talked people into having colonoscopy right after they crossed the finish line for marathon running. So I can't imagine people would agree to that, but they did. And they found that they had poor circulation to their intestines. The blood is shunted with extreme exercise, and it's away from the intestine. So I've had other patients with other things like colitis and so on talk about performance issues during running. I had mentioned earlier that you can get too much phlebotomy, and I think this is an example of that. So I think if he's better at 100, he could stick at 100. There's nothing magic about 50.
Another question about the link between hemochromatosis and osteoporosis.
Well, it's out there. You know, osteoporosis is very common in the general population. So you better be sure you have a control group when you're claiming that it's increased in hemochromatosis. It hasn't been extensively studied. In men, sometimes they think having a low testosterone could contribute to that problem as well. It's probably relevant because there's a number of new medications on the market that help with that problem. So there's some benefit to finding out if you have low bone density. It's a type of x-ray that will determine that. It's not a regular x-ray, it's a special x-ray for bone density, and it's pretty easy to get that done in a city in Canada.
Great. We had a couple questions here, quite a few about treatment, concerns where their family doctor doesn't really have the treatment option for them, and then also Canadian Blood Services won't take their blood. So what do you recommend in this situation where their doctor about it?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the first thing, that the family doctor doesn't have the treatment option. That probably means that the family doctor doesn't have admitting privileges at the hospital that has the phlebotomy center.
Right.
So if that's the case, then the patient should be referred to a specialist at that center. And it might be hematology, it might be gastroenterology. It should be fairly easy to find out whether people are being treated there. You know, you could phone the clinic and talk to the nurses that do phlebotomy and see which doctors are involved with that, and then be asked to be referred to that doctor. And as I mentioned, for the family doctor, it's a relief if they can find a solution to this. Now, the patients are frustrated that the blood donor can't become their regular treatment. That's because the blood banking does not want to be in charge of the treatment of the patient. However, if you are one of the people that requires maintenance therapy, going to be a blood donor, you can only go every 3 months. And if you went every 3 months for maintenance, that would be fine for almost everybody. So that's a nice option that Canadians have that is not so easy to do that in America because they have all these restrictive rules. Most of Europe is like Canada. So that's a good option. The patients like it because they don't have to schedule the phlebotomy. They can go whenever they want. It's free parking, all that kind of stuff. But as I mentioned at the end there, just try to find some common ground with your doctor about this treatment. And I don't know what the doctor would have said to the person, that you're going to get no treatment or they're looking into it or what. I don't know. But you don't go with no treatment until you've failed one of the treatments.
Another question here, is it possible to be diagnosed with hemochromatosis without the classic known genetic variants?
It is, but that's the 1 in 2 million sort of thing. And it's very uncommon. We didn't find a single case in the AIR study. So we had over 100,000 patients and we didn't find one case like that. What is really common is to have a high ferritin and have a normal genetic test. And if that's the scenario, then that person should reflect on whether they have the other risk factors. Are they overweight and drink a lot? And if the answer is yes, that is most likely the cause of the high ferritin, and it's not iron overload.
If they did have one of the rare variants, would it be treated the same way?
It would be. The most, I would say the most common one, and they're not common, would be hemojuvelin disease. This is a very scary disease. It occurs in a much younger age group. The patients are often in their 20s, and they have severe shortness of breath and heart problems, and they often die. And that's a disease that has been studied in quite a bit of detail in northern Quebec, like north of Chicoutimi. There's families that intermarry, and there's been lots of studies there. It's also common in the Mennonite community. And the gene for this condition is totally different than the HFE gene. It's on different chromosomes. It's on chromosome 1. And this gene was discovered in Canada, in Vancouver. So the treatment would be phlebotomy, but it's sometimes too late. The patient is advanced by the time you get to them. And in this other disease, like ferroportin, and remember, I've never seen a case, and I got a clinic full of people who think they have these things. Apparently, they don't respond well to phlebotomy. That is, you do phlebotomy and they become anemic very quickly.
Jeff wants to know if the new normal is 600 for ferritin.
That's a good question. And, it begs the question of how do we determine normal ranges for any blood test? Well, the first thing you'll notice is that blood testing labs never talk about normal anymore. They talk about reference ranges. I guess that's because there are no normal people anymore. And if you look at how big labs in the US determine a range for anything, blood sugar, cholesterol, ALT, hemoglobin, all that stuff, they use something called the NHANES survey. This is a national health survey done in the US. They go to the voters list and they send these people very detailed questionnaire about their health. Do you have cancer? Have you ever donated blood? Do you drink a lot? All this kind of stuff. And if you look good on this questionnaire, like you don't have anything wrong with you, you're invited to participate in this survey. And then you go down to your local blood lab, they draw blood, your name isn't on the blood tubes, you're just part of this study, and they send the blood to Washington, DC, and those become the group of people that will define the normal range. Now, in the NHANES survey, it's about 15,000 people. Now, you know, in the AIR study, we had 100,000 people. So there's more power with more people. But you could say that those 15,000 that they sampled were a very purified population because they said no to everything on the questionnaire. But maybe you want what's out there in the general population. You don't just want the purified people. And then once you get all these lab tests done, there is something called distributional statistics that are applied. So for example, you would take the average of all the blood tests, say ferritin, and then you would look at the standard deviation. This is the variability, low and high, around the average. And you'd go 2 standard deviations in each direction. And that would give you the range for the test. Now, when they did that in NHANES, in men, for ferritin, the upper range was 300. When they did that in the AIR study, with a much larger sample, the upper range was 660 for men. So that's where this idea comes out that maybe we should have a reference range up to 600. And they've really kicked this around in Australia. There have been several papers written around it. And we spend a lot of money in clinic investigating people that have relatively minor elevations in ferritin, say between 300 and 600. That's what most of the clinic is. It's uncommon for people to show up with ferritins of 10,000, 20,000. But when they do, we really pay attention to that.
Another question from Elizabeth. She said, if the long-term survival rate for people with HHC who receive no treatment is the same or better than people who are phlebotomized, and there's been no conclusive evidence that deironing is helpful, what does this say for the whole field of?
That's exactly right. And, you know, I mentioned that Ernest Beutler, you know, who did that paper that said there were no symptoms in hemochromatosis. This guy was like a genius guy, like National Academy of Science, Royal Society of London, all this kind of stuff. And this is what he was telling people. And it was a dark era for hemochromatosis because you can imagine it's very difficult to get a research grant when those kind of things are out there being printed. You know, there were articles saying this is a gene in search of a disease. Well, it's not true. I mean, our clinic is full of people who have cirrhosis and people die of liver cancer, like Marie's husband was like that. And, you know, you could say, well, they're just dots on a graph. People die of other things. But there's definitely some mortality and morbidity out there. We have a surgeon at my hospital who presented with arthritis in his hands, in his knuckles, that was so severe that he couldn't bend his hands, so he couldn't be a surgeon anymore. So, and he had hemochromatosis. So that's another example of a severe disability from hemochromatosis. So this is not just a gene looking for a disease, but there are many people that have this gene that don't have any symptoms. And that's where those kind of stories get going. In the biobank project, I didn't show this data because we're just putting it together now, but liver cancer was increased tenfold in C282Y homozygotes compared to non-homozygotes.
All right, last question here from Brenda. She was wondering about your thoughts on Pierre's comment last month that transferritin saturation should be kept at 50% and ferritin at 50 NC per milliliter.
I'm not as enthusiastic about that as he was. He's done some of his basic research in that non-transferrin bound iron. That's a very difficult assay to do. It's a research tool, and there is some potential for toxicity. But one of the other weak links in hemochromatosis is you can't duplicate the liver disease in an animal model. You can massively iron overload mice, rats, dogs, pigs. They don't get cirrhosis. So to say that, you know, a small amount of this non-transferrin bound iron with a normal ferritin is causing liver damage, I think is a real big step. But they did a study in France. It was a survey. So that's, you know, has some intrinsic weaknesses when it's self-reported. But in their survey, the patients who had a lower transferrin saturation most of the time said they felt better than the patients that didn't have that. That's kind of the point of view that let's have phlebotomy over and over and over and over again. Now, remember I told you the doctors don't get paid to order phlebotomy. If you brought in a fee for ordering phlebotomy, you might find that the doctors want to do it every day to you. So there are a number of factors here, and the blood bank doesn't want to be intensively monitoring you for anemia because they're not your doctor taking care of you. And for your treating doctor or your family doctor to get into blood banking computers to see if your hemoglobin is falling, that's a couple of steps, you know, that are not easy. So we never do that in our clinic. We never really push. I told you we did it in the AIR study because we took people down to 20 and the nurses said they never want to do that again. But there are some people that show up in clinic with that idea.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight.